Hey folks, welcome to Roll of Law. Some of you may have just come from the Lawyers and Dragons stream where you will have seen me run an interlude one-shot adventure, and I wanted to show you guys a bit of behind the scenes, because I think that how this came about is really kind of special. So first off, David Prototopics, our usual GM, who is fantastic, was not available for this day, so he wasn't able to be there. And just by coincidence, some people reached out to me and they said, listen, we're new to D&D. We'd like to try it, but we have no idea about how to make an adventure. What does that look like? And I thought, this is a great coincidence. So I brought them on to have a chat and a discussion, and basically that we would make a 5-room dungeon together. Now, a 5-room dungeon is basically what it sounds like. I'll explain it a little further as the video goes, but it's basically a great short adventure that makes for a perfect little one-shot. And unbeknownst to them, I had a secret plan here, because we're designing this adventure and they didn't know at all that the game plan was that I would then turn around and try to run it for the Lawyers and Dragons interlude. Again, hopefully that went okay. We will see tomorrow. You guys will see that when I do. But so that's just kind of the intro of what's going on here. Again, they don't at this point know, when you're watching this, they don't know that that's what's happening. This is just kind of a fun discussion here. But this is a good video to watch just to see, how this design process can happen, how it looks. And I think the really special thing about this is that you get to see both sides of things. You get to see the video, and I'll link it in the description below so that you can check that out. But you get to see the video where, this is what the adventure looks like being run. And again, I'm not as good a DM as David/Prototopics, but so you get to see that, and then you also get to see the thought process that goes behind it. So I hope you guys enjoy this. I think it's really something, I think this is one I'm really proud of. So I will just let her roll. Basically, today I got some questions from you guys going, hey, we're new to Dungeons and Dragons, so how do we actually design an adventure? How do we run a dungeon? This kind of stuff. So what I thought we'd do is sit down and talk about a 5-room dungeon, which is really kind of the smallest thing that is really a dungeon. You can do smaller. You can do like a 1-room dragon lair or something. But a 5-room dungeon is basically all of the elements and structure of a bigger dungeon, just in the smallest form you can. And so these have a lot of advantages. One is they're real quick. If you don't have anything else planned, like let's say you've got a bunch of friends and they say, hey, let's play D&D Saturday. And you're going, it is Thursday today. And why? You could probably throw a 5-room dungeon together and stall them for a day until you do some, to give you time to do something more dramatic and more, planned out. They're also really quick. And so if you want to do like a 2-hour session, they're fantastic for that. Lots of groups will actually just do lots and lots of 5-room dungeons because they're just really kind of a nice bite-sized meal. You're going to be able to get one started and finished in the same session, and that can be fantastic. A lot of people like that a lot more than, say, I was just talking on Twitter about how I at one point ran a haunted house mega dungeon, and that took people from levels like, I think we started at level 3 and finished off at level like 18, and that's a lot of one dungeon, right? Not everybody likes that. So another really good thing I like about a 5-room dungeon is that once you've designed it, put it on your shelf. And, your shelf might be just a folder that you keep things in, but you can kind of wedge this in all sorts of places. And I have thrown in old 5-room dungeons in situations where the players didn't realize that's what I was doing. So in one case, I just described how there was like this kind of a crack in the rock, and the players were like, what's in the, and I just was describing scenery. But once they said like, oh, we want to go into this crack and see what's in there, I was like, there better be something in there. So that was just like an accident. I wasn't trying to say that this went anywhere, but that's how the players read it. So I just went in my folders and pulled out an old 5-room dungeon, and that was what was in the crack in the rock, and it made for a great little side diversion. And that took me no effort to do, right? I was able to take the players on this entire side quest that I had not planned for because I saved that. So the other thing is that the skills you learn making a 5-room dungeon, you can use to make any size of dungeon, because a bigger dungeon is basically taking all of the chunks of a 5-room dungeon and welding them together into a bigger structure. You can think of this as like those old toys where you've got the little like bits that you stick together with sticks. I forget what those are called. Or Legos, just whatever. You can just kind of weld these things together. Now, there's some other stuff that you might throw into those larger dungeons, but if you just make it with the sort of building blocks we're going to talk about, you can do huge dungeons just by going, these are the pieces, and let's stick them together into a path and so forth. So here's how a 5-room dungeon works. Room 1 is your entrance, and it should almost always be room 1. We're going to do this in a very... You can mix these rooms around, although today we're just going to sort of do them on a path. So our 5-room dungeon is basically going to be a line, which is kind of railroady, but you know what? At the end of the day, players don't usually mind that. That said, you can put these into branching paths. You can put these into things where you have to backtrack. There's all sorts of ways to do this. And you can mix this up, but how you arrange them is less important. But room 1 should almost always be room 1 because it is the entrance and some sort of obstacle. So the entrance, it does a whole bunch of things. First of all, it kind of introduces your dungeon as to what the dungeon is, right? Where are you? What are you doing? Some of that you're going to want to think of before you get there, but it's really going to give a lot of the feeling of this dungeon, right? Because if you describe it as you're walking up to the old manor house and there is lightning and there is rain, people get a feel for that, right? But if it's, you're walking up to the abandoned candy factory and you hear music and, you can smell gum on the air, people are going to have a very different sort of expectations. You can have all sorts of things there. Now, because it's Dungeons and Dragons, probably something dangerous. Usually things want to eat the players and the players want to murder those things. That's kind of the basic transaction that happens in Dungeons and Dragons, is eating versus murder. And so that kind of flavors where we're going to be going on this. But when I say an obstacle, we're going to make it expensive to go in. And expensive can mean that there's a fight. Maybe the entrance to this abandoned factory is, guarded by an ogre who is glutted on cotton candy and has a real sugar headache and is looking to tangle. But it can also be a puzzle. If you think of when they're going into the mines of Moria in Lord of the Rings, they stop for this while Gandalf is sitting there solving this riddle that, is, and then there's the water monster that's attacking him, right? And so this is an obstacle. They're going to go into the dungeon. We know they're going to go into the dungeon, but there's this thing that's happening first. And so this gets people, it gets people interested because now they're engaging with it. If it's just sort of scenery, then that's a lot of me talking to people, right? And what I want to get the players moving and engaged and engaging with the dungeon. They're not just hearing about the dungeon. They're actually, having some back and forth with that. So having said that, I've been talking for a while. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to start thinking about what kinds of things our dungeon can look like. And, I gave some examples of haunted house and abandoned candy factory, but it can be literally anything.
We're haunted candy factory.
The candy factory is actually making me think of chocolate right now. And I'm like, I want chocolate.
But there's so many possibilities, right? We could do like We could do a pirate ship. We could, and maybe people are sneaking on board this ship. It can be a woodland grove. It can be a standard dungeon. Nothing wrong with a standard dungeon.
Do we have a precipitating event in mind? Like, what's the motivation for the people?
I usually like to think of where we are first, and then we can think of our motivation, because our motivation is really going to depend on where we're going, right?
So we could always go with Haunted Mansion. That's pretty iconic. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, well, I kind of want to throw this to our sort of new DMs here and say, do you guys have anything on your mind? Like, give me some ideas as to what you're thinking, like where this could happen.
Well, I'm thinking if we go with the Haunted Mansion idea, I'm thinking all the crazy weather we've been having over here in the States is stormy night. We need shelter. Unfortunately, there is a Haunted Mansion at your disposal, and that's it. So kind of like the going in.
And Rack, are you there, or is your mic just clicking? I don't know if you're able to speak today or not. Oh, I think we've got mic troubles there. We're just going to keep forging. So Marta, any thoughts as to what kind of dungeon this should be?
I like this idea of the starting from the Haunted Mansion, especially that's the middle of the night here. So I feel the vibe behind the window. And I have some woods close by, so let's put this Haunted Mansion somewhere in the middle of the woods.
So Haunted Mansion in the middle of the woods. That's a great sort of place to go, right? And we can make a 5-room dungeon out of that without any trouble whatsoever. So, and then we've already got kind of an idea of things to get the party there. Now, one thing I'll just note here, just as a sort of pragmatic thing, is I find it's better. We've sort of got carrot and stick approaches in terms of how to get people there. And Maddie, what you suggested is an excellent stick approach, right? Bad weather is coming in. You've got to go to this manor, or it's going to suck because there's all this, it's hail, it's raining literal frogs, like whatever it is. One problem that you'll get is that a certain number of players, a lot of them, in fact, really don't like the stick. And what they will do is the instant they see you coming with the stick, they're going to find every anti-stick measure that they can. And they're going to be like, well, we've got Leoman's tiny hut. And
or a fairy ring.
And I think we might
Is this working?
That is working. Yes.
Yay!
So I always like to back up a stick when I'm using a stick with carrot, because carrot works best in my experience. But stick is good. Stick makes for great stories. So you really have to know your group as well, because there are some groups where I'm just like, I know that if the evil king tells the party to go do this or else, they're doing anything but that. Right. So that's something just to be aware of. It's a place where this is one of those things that as a new DM, you may find this out the hard way. And it can really result in a kind of awkward session, because you're like, I did the adventure, though. Like, you need to go do the adventure. And the party's going, but nah, though. Like, nah. And that's not a great place to be, especially if you're sitting there going, what else are we going to do? This is also where having that big shelf full of other 5-room dungeons is great. Because if you planned for that Haunted Mansion thing and they're like, now we're going to hang out in the weather, you're like, okay, great. The weather includes a tornado that's going to sweep you up, and now you're in this elemental chaos 5-room dungeon.
Yeah.
So,
or better yet, if it's a fork in the road and off the main road is the mansion, and they don't want to go, just have that road never ending, and it just feedbacks to the mansion. They're already in the spooky situation. They literally can't escape it.
Yeah.
Hotel California, you can't ever leave.
Exactly. You guys thought you were avoiding the spooky? You're already in the spooky.
You're already in it.
You took one
Has
step.
begun. And this gets into sort of a brief discussion on sort of railroading versus freedom in a game. Now, what railroading means is people don't like when there's no choices, because fundamentally, Dungeons and Dragons is really a game about making choices. What would my character do here? The problem is that some of those choices are really game destructive. And if you ever are a player and you really want to tank a game, you can do so just by doing things like, yeah, my character sits down in this forest and starts building a cabin. And this is a real jerk move to a DM, because the DM is like, all of the adventure is everywhere that your cabin isn't. And I would really like you to be there so that we could do things. Don't do this. Some railroading is expected. When I design, if I design a, massively complicated, mega dungeon in some ancient church, it's time for the party to go to church. But so there's a bit of kind of give and take as to sort of what an acceptable level is. And ideally, it's a situation where you're talking to your players and you can relate to that. And they might say, hey, we're feeling a little constrained, or hey, we're kind of feeling a little aimless. Because the opposite of railroading is sometimes just, we don't know what the heck we should be doing right now. Because if you present the party with, there is a whole world out there and you can do anything, they're going to go, but what should we be doing?
Right.
Where is the fun? You got to be able to point people to the fun. So that's just kind of our discussion. So having decided we're now doing a haunted house in the manor, and that people are sort of going to be led there by either weather, or we'll maybe have to come up with some sort of bait. Maybe they can hear screaming, like somebody is in danger in there. That's a kind of bait where the party can say, we are big heroes. We're going to save that person in trouble.
But also consider who the players are going to be.
Yes.
And when you know who the players are, what kind of things can you throw at them? Because you know what the player is going to respond with.
So we're holding off on that a little bit here. We'll sort of.
Generally speaking, it's something to do.
You got to know, because some players will hear, oh, hey, puppy. Some players will hear, a screaming sound, and they'll go, yeah, no, that sounds like danger, and we don't want any part of it.
Right.
And this is kind of part of bad character design, because typically you want, characters who want to go towards the danger. But sometimes you've got a group where that's how people think. And so you might need to think, okay, it's got to be money that lures them. Something along those lines. So you might want to, then you could tell players like, oh, hey, can you guys give me a history check? Okay, well, you recognize this as the lost summer cabin of this family, and they were loaded, and they had this summer cabin, and it's like nobody ever knew where it was when they died, and I bet there's all sorts of money in there. And then you've got other people going, money, say.
Gimlet.
I mean, you're not wrong. So that's kind of our, we've sort of got an initial idea there. And you don't need to flesh it out entirely, because part of running the dungeon is going to be thinking this stuff up on the fly. And if I wanted to put a bunch of work in this, maybe the next step I do is throw a creepy mansion into Midjourney and come up with some images. Now, it just so happens that I was actually doing that earlier today, unrelated to this, believe it or not, but related to my sort of other things. So, I might actually have some creepy mansions that I could throw up here. Let me see if I can just put up a creepy mansion here for just a second. Because then we can say, what's that?
I said, while you're digging through that, I was thinking, it's like, well, there's also, if it is bad weather, to make the haunted mansion a tricky haunted mansion, and they have like this sound of music and a party going on where they think, oh no, it looks haunted, but it's not really that bad. And then when they get in, it's
Or they can be a lady that is inviting them, like, oh my God, dear travelers, what are you doing here? I'm really not a ghost.
But
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, you could do all sorts of things like that. And I will say that one thing I will note about tricky things is I always like to be careful with that. And there's one specific reason for that. If you are tricky too often, tricky is good. Don't get me wrong about that. Tricky is good. But if you're tricky too often, then eventually they expect everything is going to be a trick. And that is not a place you want to be. So, you can, if you have lots of time, you could generate something like this with Midjourney. And then you've got like, hey, here is a creepy manor house, right?
I'm not going in there.
Yeah.
You can't make me.
The downside is that this might be too creepy.
I love those types of things. So I'm like, ooh, what's inside?
It's not so bad. You don't have to carve your way through the bushes to get inside. The door was clearly visible. It's good in the Urbex standard.
And this is the other thing I'll warn about using pictures like this, because the first thing Marta's an excellent player, because the first thing she spots is, let's look at entrances. And I can guarantee you that somebody's going to go, you know what? The DM's got a plan for what happens when we go through the door. We're going through a window. You've got to learn. You got to learn who your group is, and part of learning who your group is starting off with little adventures and seeing how they react, and kind of learning the hard way. And again, 5-room dungeons are great as let's run this as a first dungeon, and then we can see, we can learn some things. So we need something to make the first sort of entry. And in this case, I'll probably modify that and say all the windows are too high up, or they're too narrow, or whatever. You guys can't get in the windows, just because we're really going to push people on a direct line here. But we need something to say, like, what is our initial challenge? And so this could be like a monster. Maybe there's zombies, maybe there's scary ghosts, but it could be something else, like some sort of puzzle or difficulty. So anyone have any thoughts for what our sort of initial difficulty with getting in the house is?
What if it's locked? It's just locked. But add an extra layer to that. If there are windows on the inside, from the outside looking in, it looks like there's some kind of a party going on in there, and you just hear a lot of noise and you hear a lot of movement. So it's very loud on the other side, but then you go to open the door's locked.
I like it. And you can say doors, you can enhance that as well, because you can say like doors locked and has a weird green glow. Now it's like, ooh, this is a scary door, not just because locks are not always the greatest in Dungeons and Dragons, because they kind of just come down to a skill check, which is fine. Like you want to give things where like your rogue is good at picking locks. So as some DMs are like, okay, the lock is not going to be any challenge to the rogue. I actually want to throw things at the rogue that I know they're really going to be good at, because then the rogue feels like an awesome person. Like, hey, I am the best lock picker ever, and look at how great picking this lock is, right? So you want people to feel good about some of the stuff that they're skilled at. So let's start with a locked door, but I think I want to figure out some additional complication on this. So because I think I want to make there's something else, right? And the wonderful thing about that is that then you can say the rogue is picking the lock, while everyone else has to deal with the something else. And that gets everybody involved, and it sort of creates some tension. I like this idea, but I don't know what the something else is. So we're designing a whole dungeon. We can come back to this. And this is just sort of part of how thinking these things up goes. You don't have to design everything all at once or in order. You can go back and forth. You can do all sorts of things. You can, I often sort of have a little notebook. And I mean, often I use my phone now, but not always. I like to have a little paper notebook where when weird Dungeons and Dragons or whatever ideas hit me, I can just scribble out something like, pit trap with ooze. That sounds like fun. And then I can use that later. All right. So you just kind of
the image of that. I was like, oh yeah, that's fun.
Yeah.
yeah, it's you want things that are sort of challenges there. So room 2 is usually something that is sort of, and in this sort of traditional layout of this, is something that is sort of a non-combat, but like a puzzle or role-playing encounter. So something where people have to engage with the story, but it's not just a let's throw dice at this. It's something where people have to do some thinking and some pondering. So if you think of Harry Potter, where there's that whole chessboard problem, that's a puzzle. And a role-playing encounter can be just about anything. It can be, the angry gardener doesn't, like, let's say that our starting thing wasn't actually at the front door. Let's say it was at the outside, the edge of the sort of outside wall. Well, now maybe there's an angry gardener who doesn't want to let people go up to the house. He's telling people to go away from the house. That's a role-playing encounter. How do we talk past this guy? Or do we just say, you know what? And this guy's not strong. You could push him into a bush if you want. But maybe there's consequences if you push him into a hedge. Maybe there's bad things that happen. Maybe there's reasons you don't want to just shove this guy into a hedge and say, tough, we're going in anyway. But even if that's what people do, it gives them an opportunity. Oh, and it looks like we've got the mic reconnecting here. This gives people an opportunity to kind of showcase their characters a little bit. Who are your people? Because if you're talking about something like, that chessboard puzzle, well, now it's kind of a question of, what strategy does Gimlet take to solve this? Is kind of an idea, right? It's so this is, there's all sorts of possibilities. So we were talking about haunted house. You just get into this haunted house after you get in the front door. What kind of puzzle or role-playing encounter can we throw in here?
Someone asking if you have an invite, because we already established that there may be this party. So someone semi-looking like alive or not. Where are your invites?
Oh, take the creep factor up. Oh, sorry. Yeah, take the creep factor up. As soon as they open the door and step inside, there is no party. It's a ghost.
Okay.
It's a ghost town. There's no one there.
That's what I was wondering. It's like opening the door, the sound stop, everything stopped. There's nothing there. You close the door and you hear the music again. It's like, wait, what? Because I was thinking that it was like it all just disappears, and then maybe they need to go in and investigate a little bit. Like, I'm getting images of what is that? The Stephen King Rose Red.
I haven't seen. I'm not familiar with that, but I kind of like the combination of these two. I really like the idea of they come in and the party, like all the party noises, stop and it's empty, except for a butler who's going invitation, like an undead butler going, "Where's their invitation?" And they're going, "Oh no, do we get into the party? How do we deal with this?" So now it's creepy because the party just vanished, or maybe the party's still going, but everything is stopped. And all they have is this butler going, "Where's the invitation?" And now they have to role play with this butler. Now they're going to have this dialogue. So I think we've got a fantastic idea here for sort of what our puzzle / role-playing encounter can look like. And the other thing to remember about, this kind of thing is that there's all sorts of solutions. You might come up with one or two solutions in your head about how this could be worked out. Maybe the party could be thinking, or could, trick the butler into thinking they are invited guests. That's a great option. Or maybe they could convince the butler that they're actually here to be help. And so then they end up with like their own ghostly, servant outfits and get to go into this party. And that's creepy too, right? But you also need to maintain some flexibility, because I guarantee you that the answers you choose to a puzzle are not the only answers. there's probably some other really clever ideas. And if the party comes up with a clever idea, let it work. A lot of D&D DMing is sort of getting to yes. And getting to yes in a way that doesn't feel free, like it doesn't feel like there's no challenge, but it also feels like the world is kind of cooperative because you're the heroes, right? Things should work out for the heroes. Not necessarily smoothly or evenly, but at the end of the day, you don't want to just be the guy going, I'm probably really sort of aging myself here. Have any of you played text adventures?
No.
Oh, yeah.
So if you play like the old Zork games, sometimes they were infamous for like, there is a puzzle where you need to smash a bottle. And to do that, you need to use the baseball bat. And you're sitting there going, but I have this metal ingot in my inventory. So use ingot to smash bottle. And it's like, no, because you didn't figure out how to smash the bottle in the exact way that the designers thought you needed to. You don't want your game to feel like that because those moments sucked. Those were not a whole lot of fun.
Those were the moments where you're screaming at the thing, just do it!
Starcross, there's a moment where you're having to use a rifle butt to get a anthill off a console. And figuring out the exact command to make that work that they thought of, because that's an unusual motion, right? Using a rifle butt to get... Figuring out what you had to type to get it to parse that was not fun. And you don't want to be the DM version of that. So that's just something to think about here. Now that we've got this puzzle here, we can also think about, like, we've got a whole other room behind us to play with. And so we can put some hints here. Maybe the door has the crest of the family that this house used to belong to. And so a party member who made a history check back at the door to figure out who this house belonged to is going to have an advantage now when they're going in to lie to the butler, because at least, if you're saying, hey, I'm here as a guest, isn't it going to be helpful if you can say who you're a guest of? So now we can sort of back work and string things together to sort of make this puzzle more interesting as well. So that's something else to think about as we get to sort of room 2. Now, room 3 is kind of a fun one because room 3 is a setback or a problem or something tricky or something along those lines. Because, this is a place where you're essentially going to be causing trouble for the party. And so if we remember our... if we remember like the pilot episode of Lawyers and Dragons, remember how there was that big spider that came down on everybody?
Yes.
Lovely spider.
Trick or setback. Like, this is a bad thing because, oh my God, we're being attacked by a giant ambush spider. So that is the kind of thing we got to think about here is like, what kind of things can we throw in that are some sort of wrinkle or, and this can be any sort of thing. And when we're talking about a haunted house, we've got all sorts of advantages. But for instance, let's say we were doing this in that candy factory, right? Well, maybe there's a gumball avalanche and, something breaks free and the party gets swept along on this tide of, rolling gumballs. Because that's a bit of a sillier idea, right? But we're on a more serious kind of tack with the haunted house. So anybody have any thoughts as to what sort of things we can do to sort of create a big problem for people? Something that they've got to, this is really to ramp up the tension, right? This is where things start getting real for the party, right? This is where, oh no, this is really kind of a dangerous or a difficult thing. So that's what we're kind of looking for here.
And you'd also try to think of it as what kind of combat encounter could you throw at them here? Assuming they got through part 1 and 2 unscathed, by part 3, you definitely want to throw some kind of light combat situation in.
It doesn't necessarily need to be a combat encounter, but I would say it should be sort of a danger encounter.
Sure.
So as an example, like let's say people are crossing a bridge and that bridge starts collapsing as they're walking across it, right? It's like, oh crap, we are in danger. We could fall into off this cliff, which, might cause us tremendous damage. So any thoughts as to what we could do as a sort of combat moment or a setback here?
I was actually thinking, depending on how well you're able to convince the butler, if we have the butler there, if, say, we failed and he he decides, okay, I'm going to trick them into going into this room, and that's a room that, well, if we go with the falling thing, since this is an old mansion, probably has wooden floors, so it's like you're going into this room that's basically kind of like a collapsing floor.
Pitfall trap.
Yep. That type.
Pitfall trap is a great one. And then we can also put, like, if we want to have a combat encounter, we can put some stuff at the bottom of the pitfall trap, right? Because a pitfall trap basically moves people from one place to another and hurts them in the process. So we can put all sorts of things down there. We can put poison gas. We can put zombies. We can put,
Spiders.
Spiders.
Skeletons.
Indiana Jones falls through a thing, and it's like, why did it have to be snakes? Right? All of these are great options, and typically you're going to want to kind of flavor your setback as something that is menacing in some way, right? Because typically you want people to feel endangered. So we've got a pitfall trap and some sort of falling thing as a possibility here. So what kind of things might we put at the bottom of this?
We're going, okay, for the ghostly. Meow. Please excuse the sound effects.
It's okay. My thinking has sound effects.
I'm kind of. It's a halfling.
Yes, there's 2 halflings roaming.
At least they're not Harfoots.
I'm actually kind of was going with this type of house, maybe a skeleton or zombie type thing there, like not overly crowded, but a couple in the shadows that you're not seeing just quite yet. Or you may land right on top of it. Who knows?
And if you wanted to go for creep factor, you can go for like undead giant rats.
Yeah, you know what? I would rather have those than the spiders.
Yeah, definitely better than spiders.
Giant rats.
So
Gross rats.
So if we're going with like a collapse into undead giant rats, that's a perfectly good setback, right? So maybe the butler tells them, either like go this way, and then they're walking down this hallway and the floor collapses. And now they've got these rats menacing them. That's a perfectly good setback or trap or trick. So good. We're good to go on that. So the next one is fun, because the next is the climax, or the boss fight. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, one boss, because one boss typically is harder to do in Dungeons and Dragons, but this is the big fight. Like, this is the big showdown. And Dungeons and Dragons typically leads to a big conflict. So we've been sort of talking about this haunted house with this party going on. That kind of leads me to think maybe the party is the big showdown, right? But the party doesn't have to be. The party can be the reward. The party can be the sort of what the happy ending is. So what do we think we like? Do we like the party as the sort of the big fight, or something else?
I like the idea of the party with the so-called owner of the establishment. That it's like at the end, all these guests are like in the front and the guy is at the end, or the lady of the house.
So, if they're walking into an undead party, that sounds like a bad scene, right? And you can have the moment of everybody walks into the party and the party stops, like record scratch, and everybody turns and the party goes, oh, this is a bad moment. And then it's roll for initiative, and and you get to have all sorts of conflict. Now, this is actually a place that I want to spend a little bit of effort. Now, I don't have mapping software up, but one of the things I'm going to do here, if nothing else, is I'm going to sketch something out for what this is going to look like, at least. And I might not be using like a battle map or anything like that. You can, but you don't have to. But I like to think about what else is in this room, because it's really easy to make your fights happen in kind of an empty room with nothing happening. And that gets really kind of samey after a while. So what I like to think is, what is there going on in this room that might be interesting? And so I'm thinking like, it's a party hall, right? So there's probably tables with chairs. Maybe people can flip the tables for cover. Maybe some of the enemies will do that. Maybe some of the enemies will flip a table and start throwing things. Because then that gives some tactical considerations. The party's got to go around these tables, or they've got to go through or over these tables. Maybe there's a chandelier. I like a chandelier. We're putting a chandelier in here because what happens when there's a chandelier? Inevitably, somebody's going to swing on it, or they're going to cut it down. Chandelier is fantastic. So let's throw a chandelier in here. Just things so that there's some interesting elements to it, right? And there's all sorts of ways you could do this. If it's in a forest, maybe there's a river running through your big boss fight. And maybe the boss is kind of nimble and can jump over the river, whereas the party's not so nimble and might have to figure out other ways to deal with it, ranged attacks or something else, along those lines. Or maybe the boss is like a big, strong giant and can pick people up and chuck them in the river. That's even more dangerous, right? So these are things where the party now has to start thinking about it, and it makes the encounter a little bit more alive and dynamic. And I think this is especially important for your boss fight. So that's always something to think about with this. But there's other things you can do. Like maybe the big bad boss is vulnerable to fire. And maybe you've put some hints along those lines. So there's questions about how do you set this boss on fire? These are all kinds of things that you want to think about. All right. So the last room is basically, this is essentially your wrap-up room. And so your wrap-up room can be treasure, like you find loot. Loot is a really common one. Your wrap-up room can also be things like you can put another encounter in here if you want. This can be another sort of fight scene. You can make this a role-playing room. Like maybe if the party was going in there because they're looking for a lost child, say, this is where they would find the lost child, and you can have some role play with this kid. And, the kid is happy that they're being rescued. And, so this is kind of a letdown in some ways. Because if you just go, you guys win the big boss fight and adventure's over, see you guys next week. That's not super satisfying. When you watch a movie, they do this in every movie you've ever seen. There is the big fight where they, defeat the giant villain. And then there's the scenes of how they clean up the damage and how they go on to live happily ever after and so forth, right? Wesley defeats and rescues the princess and the princess bride. And then there's discussion of, here they are escaping and here they are, doing their thing. And, here he is passing on the mantle of Dread Pirate Roberts. All of that is sort of the wrap up here. This is also a great place to put a hook. And what I mean by a hook is something that connects in some way to other role playing. So if you're putting this in the context of a larger campaign, this is a great place, for instance, for the party to find a clue about another dungeon. Or maybe they find something out about, one of the NPCs. Maybe the local king turns out to be related to these dudes. And, that's concerning because if these were a bunch of evil people who turned into evil undead, maybe that's a problem, right? This could be all sorts of things. There's lots of stuff you can put in there. And again, I'm going to, a lot of the guides, like if you look up 5-room dungeons online, you'll find a lot of guides saying things like, this is a great place to put a trick where the whole adventure turns out to have been a trick. Like they were hired to go and rescue the child, but it turns out the child is the grand mastermind of everything.
That's a twist.
You can do it. Twists are good. But you want to be sparing with your twists because I call this sort of the Shadowrun problem. And Shadowrun is an entirely separate game. Shadowrun is set in basically modern times with magic and cyberpunk. And in Shadowrun, you're typically getting hired by a guy who is unfortunately named Mr. Johnson. This is the slang. He's not actually named Mr. Johnson. It's just the name all of these guys give as like, this is the generic name and stop asking who I am, right? That's kind of what that's about. And they'll say like, listen, we need you to break into this other corporate headquarters and steal the MacGuffin for us. Now, lots of people go, okay, this should be a betrayal. Mr. Johnson is actually setting you up and he's going to steal the MacGuffin or he's just sending you into an ambush. And the problem is that if every time the party gets hired to do something, they're getting sent into an ambush or a trick or something like that, pretty soon, the next guy is coming, I have a mission for you. And they're like, great. And they shoot him in the face. And now you can't run adventures because you don't have the ability to sort of get them interested in anything. So you have to be really sparing about this. The whole curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal is great so long as the sudden but inevitable betrayals happen rarely enough that they are still a surprise. If you ever see your players go, oh, not again, when they get hit with you got to dial that back and because you've gone too far, right? You always want it where people have the reaction of like, oh, that bastard, when somebody tricks them. And if they just sort of are going, oh yeah, of course he did, then you're not in Happy Town. So I like to put this as like a reward, a wind down, and also sometimes a lead in. Like this is and because these 5-room dungeons are so small, they're great as like a small interlude in a larger plot element. If the party is trying to solve the puzzle of who is this evil lich, and a lich is a very powerful undead sorcerer, and you're saying, okay, we need to solve the issue of who is this evil sorcerer and how do we actually kill him permanently, because liches are quite difficult to kill permanently. You can run a 5-room dungeon as a party's going here to get a clue, right? Maybe this is the guy's childhood home. And so you're invading this space in order to find that clue. They're great for this because it doesn't feel so long that it's like, what were we doing again? Like, oh, that lich, we forgot his name and what he's about. That was like 10 years ago. So it's nice and small for that. It's just the right size for this kind of purpose. So that's just sort of things we can think about. So in this case, we've just defeated the evil party of undead, right? The evil, and we can get music for this. Like we can, if we're putting effort into this, we can make this a whole big boss theme. The band plays on as the fight happens. The undead band is going to keep playing. Because that's awesome.
Smooth jazz.
Yeah.
No, Undead Mariachi Band.
See? So now that they've defeated, where are we going with this? Like, what's our sort of wrap-up scene on this?
If the party kills everyone, then they can explore a bit and find stuff there. or maybe also find a place to sleep, considering that they were running from the weather. And they can find, if we go with that, it's the childhood home, so maybe some diaries or something like that, some notes that will give, if they will investigate it, then it will give them some clues in the end.
I kind of like the like they get a place to sleep. I'm just thinking we've already set this up as kind of a changing house, right? People come in, the party stops, they get into the party room, the party's back on again. Maybe once the sort of ghosts are defeated, maybe the house becomes a nice little cabin again, and maybe it's not fantastic, but it's not like 300 years of rot kind of thing. And now the party can do some poking around, and they can go, hey, we actually get this house. It's off in the middle of nowhere, but we could use this as like a forest base kind of thing. And I'm a big proponent of giving players real estate. There's all sorts of reasons why I like this, but if you've got something where the players are attached to a space, that is fantastic. So we can, and they can start. So I like the idea of this house is sort of restored, and now they can poke around, they can find some clues, but they also are like, this could be our place. And the thing is it works better on stuff like that if you don't suggest to them that this could be your place. Like, hey, you guys can keep this house now. One of them could go, well, nobody owns this place, right? And then it's players who came up with a clever idea, and they didn't really realize that you were being clever about this the whole time. There's a certain amount of D&D where it's basically like you put the shiny thing in front of them, and then you look away, and the players are being clever as they take the shiny thing, and you're like, but that was the whole point. So this is kind of a skill you cultivate as sort of guiding people along without forcing them. But I've been playing for like 30 years now. So sometimes when David is running things, I'm like, I see he's laying down the shiny thing. And I see that the party is going to go for the shiny thing. And it's like, I can see it happening, and I appreciate, like, you can sort of recognize that, like, this is really being well done, and that's just sort of a skill set you learn. Often earlier on, like as you're learning, don't be afraid to tell people that you're learning. Nobody is super expert all the time, and anybody who is unwilling to put up with you having some growing pains is somebody you don't want at your table anyway, because they're just going to be a jerk when that happens, right? So be honest with people about where you are and that you're learning, because if people freak out about that, they were going to freak out when you had trouble with something or something along those lines. But these are important skills as you sort of learn, and hopefully people will be sort of fairly decent about all that as you go. So I think we've got a pretty good 5-room dungeon here. Now, this is at this point just sort of the basic ideas of it. You can go back through this and you can do all sorts of things. Like maybe I go back to Midjourney and I try to see if it can generate like a banquet hall for an image of where we're fighting. But I don't need to, but I could. Like all of this is an option. One thing I will have to do is design my combat encounters. And there's all sorts of different philosophies about this. If you're playing D&D and you're looking at the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monstrous Manual, you've got a whole bunch of monsters there. And so you might decide, okay, these are going to be, wraiths. And then it'll give you some guidelines as to how many wraiths you should put in there to challenge the party. Because you don't want to make your fights too lethal, and you also don't want to make them too easy, right? The big boss fight should be something challenging. People should be worried, but you don't want everybody to feel like they've just gone 4 rounds against the MMA champion of the world and just, had their nose rubbed in the mats the whole time. Like, that's not fun. Nobody wants to play like it's one thing if you are Superman fighting, whoever. But it's another thing if it feels like you're John Wick versus King Kong. John Wick is a badass, but he's not winning that fight. He's getting stepped on.
Are we sure about that?
I'm not entirely sure, but like,
if it's a guy in a rubber suit, Kong's losing.
oh yeah. But I mean, you got to sort of think about things in the sense of like, John Wick is a much more interesting movie when he's fighting all sorts of other people who are, random guy armed with guns and some skills. He's not having a great day if you're putting him up against Superman. Because, he goes up and shoots Superman in the face 3 times and Superman goes, neat. And now that's sort of the end of your movie, right? You want to have some balance on this. And it makes for a much more fun experience for everybody. How do you get good at this? Well, there's 2 real keys to this. Number 1 is practice. Especially because the Dungeon Master's Guide is full of the DM books are full of monsters that seem like they are going to be super easy to run and end up being super tricky. As an example, we're running a little haunted house thing. So I might look through the monsters manual and I might see shadows, which are a neat monster. They are like literally people's shadow brought back as an undead creature. The person is dead, or sometimes not. Sometimes they've just been split apart, and so their whole existence has been kind of split in 2. But like a shadow creature is super thematic. It's super scary. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, those buggers punch way above their weight class. And they are kind of infamous for being the monster that you accidentally kill the entire party with. There's a few of those in the books where it's just like this monster that doesn't seem like it should, like it's all that bad, is actually super dangerous for what they rate it as. Quicklings are another one that's detailed in a book. They're little fairy creatures that basically live life at 10 times speed, so they move real fast, and they're basically little jerks. They're also super deadly. And like the book ranks them as though they're like, oh yeah, you can take these, no problem, but they will murder the heck out of you. And so if you're looking at the numbers and you're like, oh yeah, the party can take 3 of these things, you're gonna kill the party.
You're gonna have a bad time.
Yeah, and the way you find out about this is partially you can look, if you just plug your monster name in and you start seeing a whole bunch of like Reddit posts about people going, oh my god, I accidentally killed my party with this. That's a subtle clue, like just a little tiny hint that this is maybe one of those monsters. But the other thing, and this is a really important one, is cheat.
Okay. Noted.
Very important.
Because sometimes you're going to have to, because everybody screws this up at some point. And it's one thing if, players don't like if you cheat to make your fight harder. And so you should generally avoid that. Sometimes your fight is just easier than you wanted it to be, and the players mop the floor with it. And you can just talk them up as like, you guys just cleaned house on this. And what you don't say is, I screwed up. That fight was not Instead, you tell them how awesome they are, right? Because people always love hearing that. But the other way, where you're suddenly going to kill the party, is a time to start doing things like quietly fudging their hit points in a downward direction. And, don't tell people that you're doing this. Don't be like, oh, I was going to murder you guys, so I just decided to, push the win button on this one. Because that makes people feel really unhappy. But this is something that you should do at times. There's lots of people who disagree with me, and I guarantee you the same people who will post vociferously online about how much they hate if their DM fudges things also hate if they get curb stomped because their DM just happened to, misread something. I once misread a challenge rating of 5 as a 3 when I was designing things because I was tired, and accidentally threw the players into an encounter that by all rights should have just been a meat grinder, and the party dies. And, And then we sit around and have awkward pizza because I budgeted for like we're gonna have a 4-hour session, and I murdered everybody in the first 15 minutes. So we're just gonna kind of eat pizza we ordered and kind of be like, so that happened, didn't it? Yeah, no, that's not a scenario you want. So plan this out and think a little bit, like look over your monster statistics a bit and try to determine if you're in a situation where the party is going to be especially good at killing something or especially bad at it. Because both of those things can happen, especially with things where you've got an adventure that's kind of designed around one kind of monster. Like, hey, we've got undead. Well, what if we've got a paladin in the group? Because paladins are great at murdering undead. Now we got to think about that, right? What if we've got a cleric in the group? Because they're even better sometimes at killing undead. Maybe we'll want to make the fights a little bit harder to compensate. But let's say we're dealing with a whole bunch of things that need magic weapons to hit. And nobody in the party has magic weapons. And there's only one spellcaster who's really the person who can go after these things. Maybe I want to tone it down, right? People are going to be feeling pretty threatened by these monsters if they're very much limited in their ability to hit them. So another thing to sort of think about. Treasure. Because we said, hey, we're going to give rewards here. The reward of, hey, we're going to give these people a house is a great reward, but you can't do that every time because people will end up with like 62 houses and they will not be interested in that. There's a certain point where it's like you just retire and become a real estate magnate because if you got more houses than Monopoly, you're just like, what are we doing here?
The gift at the end is life.
Yeah. That is the thing. Right?
Congrats.
Money is always good, but you need to have cash sinks if you want to make money meaningful. There's got to be things people can spend money on. And, if you want money to mean anything beyond just personal satisfaction, like Gimlet will always chase another bag of money because sure, he's got one in his bag of holding and another one hidden away that he's going to go recover later.
In the epilogue of the game.
But there's, but like, couldn't he have a third bag of money? Wouldn't that be a good thing? Like,
what about the third?
But like Lima might not be so interested in like a third bag of money. She might be like, we already have a giant bag of money. Aren't we good? And especially if it's like chasing the money into a pit trap, she'd probably be like, we're good. We got this bag of money. We don't need that bag of money that's in the dangerous thing.
I will drop a cat on the pit trap. That is all you need.
What if it's a bag of money with a cat?
She is diving head first into the pit trap.
And that's the thing. You learn what motivates people. Like, she'd be much more motivated by, oh, that's a cute animal. And, so you've got to figure out where these levers are. And you want to keep, once you've got those, you kind of want to keep them active. You don't want to have it where like, let's curse Gimlet so that he can't ever have money. Like, okay, now it's just harder to run adventures for Gimlet, right? That doesn't work so well. Or Lima has somehow lost interest in, cute cats.
Got an allergy.
Yeah. She's going to be less interested. You want to keep those. So that can be a consideration in terms of cash. And the other consideration is that you're going to have an entire book full of really cool magic items. And you're probably going to be looking at these things going, man, these are really cool. And a lot of them are a great way to break your game and make it less fun for everybody. Because if the party suddenly is super awesome, and especially if like one or two people in the party are suddenly super awesome and everybody else isn't, your game can start to go real bad. So you want to be not stingy with this kind of stuff, but you want to ration it out in a way that is slow and incremental. Because if you're just like, hey, we're going to give the sword of godly power to the fighter, well, then maybe the rogue is sitting there just watching the fighter kill everything with this sword of godly power and going, but I also like to roll some dice too sometimes, guys, and I would also like that to be meaningful. So that kind of stuff can make it much harder for you to balance your encounters as well. Because if the party has a wand that lets them shoot fireball 4 times every day, now you got to start factoring that in every time you start doing these calculations, right? Because we're having this one big party in the day. If they're able to throw 4 fireballs at it, that party's probably crispy before much time has passed. So it's always better to err on the side of too little than too much. You can fix too little. Too much is a lot harder to fix unless you've got a really mature group that is going to be okay with you taking stuff away. Most groups kind of are of the view that once they have something, it is their precious, no matter what it is. It can be a shiny rock that does, plays, or like a magical stuffed fish that sings a song. And they're like, you cannot take my magical stuffed fish. This is an important part of my character. My entire character arc is now based around this fish.
It happens.
And usually they're not going to do it over the stuffed fish. They're going to do it over the wand that shoots 4 fireballs a day. That you're like, that is the problem item that I never should have given them. And they're like, but it's mine now. And I love it. And,
this is my whole personality now.
Yes.
Don't talk to me or my child ever again.
So, yeah, I mean, Lord of the Rings is perfectly fine with like one character having a magical invisibility ring while like everybody else has potatoes. But that's because it's a movie. If you actually run this as an adventure, everybody else is like, where's my invisibility ring? Like, we've spent how much time talking about like Frodo doing his magic bullshit, and now here I am going like, I would like to do that. So that's kind of another cautionary note. But yeah, if you want to scale these up, you can repeat these. Like, you can just start saying like, every so often we need to have a setback. You can have mini boss fights. Like, you can have your big boss fight, but you can also have little mini boss fights spread around a bigger dungeon. The other thing you're probably going to add if you're doing like a big dungeon that we don't have in our 5-room dungeon design is scenery. Because sometimes an encounter is just you sort of talking about where they are and what's interesting. Like, you guys have wandered into an underground cavern and it's lit by all sorts of multicolored fungus, and there's a deer down here for some reason. You're like 100 feet below the surface, and there's a deer here that's grazing on the fungus, and it's just like, this is just a little quiet spot. And if the party wanted to have a rest here, sure, great. Nothing's going to eat them. It's just, you're kind of giving some flavor. And this is a place where if the party is sort of creating a mental map in their head, they might think, okay, well, we can sort of plan things out from that glowing fungus room. Like, okay, this is, a landmark. I have a dungeon that I've run several times because it's just one of those things that, like, once you've done it, you can adapt it pretty quickly. And it's a tomb of basically a king who thought he was the best person ever. And so there's rooms that just aren't, combat encounters or anything else. They're just telling you a little bit more about what this tomb is and putting it in the larger context of the world setting. That you're not going to do in a five-room dungeon because it's really constrained and streamlined. But if you're doing something a little broader, you might have that. Also filler rooms, because you might have things like this might be the dungeon itself can be part of a puzzle, like, mapping this dungeon out and so forth. So you might have a room that's just like, you are in a 30-foot room by 10-foot, room, and there's nothing in here. It's just filler. But we're not doing filler rooms in our 5-room dungeon because we only got 5 rooms. They all got to be good. And I mean, you could do filler rooms and just like, but the party also has this way to sort of invent role-playing encounters in filler rooms. So like, if you put an empty room with like some wrecked furniture in the corners, somebody's searching that wrecked furniture, and you're just like, okay, now is there anything in that? and when the player starts rolling dice, they expect there to be something. So think about that. Any sort of questions or thoughts about all of this?
No, it sounds like it's a pretty good encounter.
I think we've got a great little, sort of idea here. Now, I sort of, before I brought you guys in, I sort of was like, everybody's down with this being recorded. Everybody's down with, also being.
Wait, we're recording?
I already know this. And also that you guys are also down about, sort of keeping things quiet until this video comes out, because I sort of want to have a further reveal as to what we're planning on doing with this. So, we're sort of having our midway through Lawyers and Dragons kind of sort of finale, like sort of mid-season finale. Yeah. And then after that, we're going to do sort of an interlude session. And that interlude session is going to be this 5-room dungeon that we just designed.
Wow.
So, David's not around, so I'm going to be running this with sort of the rest of the group. And basically, we're just going to, you guys are going to get to see how this plays and just sort of see, and I'm going to fill this out a little bit more and so forth. But this is we have enough that if everybody started, if Alita and Rick and Rob just joined in right now, I could run this dungeon right now if we had to. Yep. That's a little bit of experience, but I've got a dungeon. I could go. So I'm going to do some filling out. I'm going to do some, additional prep, but this is going to be what we run there. So you guys, when you watch this, also have a look and just sort of see how this plays out in practice. And, you can sit there and think, and you can say, I thought this went really well. I thought this part kind of sucked. Or I thought Runkle screwed this up. Because, you know what? As long as I've been doing things, I have walked away from sessions going, man, did I pooch that? It happens. But after the session, I will put this video up with, whatever edits need to be made, which I don't think are, too significant here. And, that'll go up on Roll of Law so people can kind of see what the design process looks like kind of behind the scenes. So thank you guys for sort of the help out there. Because I'm totally stealing all your content too. But yeah, that's kind of the idea, and I hope you guys, are as excited about that as I am, because I think that this is a really sort of fun.
Can't wait to see how it goes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I'm not excited. I'm blown away. I wasn't expecting that.
I imagine Falcor and the butler are going to have some choice words, and I think you're going to have trouble getting Rob in the house.
That may be the case. I'll have to think a little bit on how to sort of massage Rob into the into that house.
drink.
Yeah.
Party. There's
Alcohol.
Drinks.
Actually, once he hears party, I bet he thinks alcohol, and I bet he's thinking. I bet he's going to think A, alcohol, and B, silverware. And alcohol and silverware will probably be enough to get him in that house. But I mean, let's say it's troublesome to get him in there. You guys will be able to see that and go, okay, for this particular group, because we didn't really, I was holding back information for you guys. So you guys weren't sort of thinking of this particular group as you're coming up with ideas here. But, we can sort of go and say, okay, well, that didn't work so well. If we were doing another adventure, how would we solve that problem? Because, you're going to, in a campaign, you're going to have many adventures. Lots of different things are going to happen. And so you're going to want to be able to adjust those things and to kind of fine tune stuff and say, okay, well, nothing needs to be a disaster. The only times you've really got a disaster is if you start some sort of interpersonal conflict, especially if it's something where it's like people are going to walk away and not be friends anymore.
Ooh, yeah.
There's a point where it's just like you walk away from the game to save your friendship, but we're not looking at that kind. That's not on the table here. So just sit and watch and look at it and go, yeah, no, we can do this better. We could. This really worked. That's the other thing is when you're going back and doing like the after session analysis, it's really easy to be the worst jerk critic to yourself because you can easily be sitting there and going, everything sucked. But especially these parts suck, but everything else also sucked. And it's really, I have this tendency where I'm going over and looking at my own stuff and I'm just like cringing and sort of sucking in air through my teeth the entire time. You need to be good to yourself as well and sort of go, these are the parts where things really clicked. And there's two reasons for that. One is just for your own mental health, because if you walk out of every session that you run and you just are sitting there going, I am the worst person ever. Why do these people put up with me? Eventually, you're going to burn yourself out. It's going to be fast, in fact. And you're going to hate it the entire time. But the other thing is you're not learning in the way that you could be. Because you also need to, with our carrot and stick example, you need to learn what things are things you should be going towards, not just things you should be avoiding. Because if you see that there's moments when the players are just like engaged and are really gripped by something, you're like, I want to do more of that because I want them to have those moments. So just sort of something else to think about when you guys sort of watch this and as we do sort of, as you kind of think about that. All right. So we've been at this for a while, so I guess I'll go ahead and sort of wrap up our recording here. I'm super excited about this. This is, when you guys said, hey, could you do a design a dungeon thing? And I was like, wait, we need like an interlude session. This is like a perfect, perfect joining of moments here. And I was like, this has got to happen. So thank you guys so much. I really appreciate that you guys reached out with the questions. And I kind of wouldn't mind doing like a D&D, let's sort of talk newbie stuff about how to run games and how to play games, just kind of as a thing that we do sort of more often. So feel free to reach out if there's stuff where you're like, hey, what about this? And thank you guys once again. And I guess I'll go ahead and hit the end recording button here.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.